47 seconds. That's all it took for Justice Alito to spit out 7 words that slashed through the room like a blade. "You fake your law degree, Miss Crockett." Cameras froze. Mouths dropped. Jasmine didn't say a word, but her silence felt like a loaded gun. What could she possibly reveal? That would make a Supreme Court justice look like a man caught lying under oath. The red tally light blinked once, then locked on steady and merciless. C-SPAN, Liev. The whole country was watching. The oversight hearing room hadn't seen this kind of weight in years. The carpet didn't even absorb sound anymore. It echoed. Every heel click, every cleared throat. Today wasn't just a hearing, it was a confrontation carved into the bones of democracy. Jasmine Crockett stepped through the double oak door's heels sharp as her stare. Her navy suit caught the light like armor. No folder, no phone, just a black envelope tucked under one arm and a silence that pressed against the walls, like pressure before a storm. She didn't scan the room. She knew exactly where he was. At the head of the chamber sat Justice Samuel Alito. Supreme Court black robe, spine-straight, hands folded. But it was the smirk that struck first, that half-smile dripping from one side of his mouth like he already knew the outcome, like the robe would protect him, like Congress was beneath him. Flashbulbs popped. Reporters barely breathed. Somewhere in the back row, a junior staffer muttered, "This feels off," and it was. The air was thick, not just with politics, but something raw, something personal. Alito wasn't just here to answer questions about ethics complaints or partisan flags on his lawn. He was here because something had cracked, and that crack was about to echo through the highest court in the land. And Jasmine, she hadn't come to accuse. She had come to reveal. What was in that black envelope? And why had she waited until today to open it? The chairman's gavel had barely settled when Jasmine Crockett leaned into her mic. Her voice was measured, almost gentle, a deliberate contrast to the storm humming beneath her ribs. "Justice Alito," she began, "in the 2014 case of Dorsey versus Kentucky, your written opinion appeared to dismiss the statistical disparity in sentencing between black and white defendants. You stated, and I quote, 'There is no constitutional right to equal outcomes.'" She paused, letting the words hang just long enough to sting. "Do you still stand by that?" Alito didn't blink. He tilted his head slightly, a gesture halfway between condescension and calculation. "Congresswoman," he said, voice smooth as polished steel, "when you sat on the bench as long as I have, you'll learn that data doesn't feel. The Constitution protects process, not feelings." The corner of his mouth curled higher. "But I understand that nuance can be difficult. For some." His eyes flicked to her envelope, then back to her. Everyone knew what he meant. He wasn't debating legal theory. He was questioning her intellect. Jasmine didn't react. Not with a smirk, not with a blink. She simply turned to a second page in her notes and continued unfazed. "In that same opinion, Justice, you also cited a study that has since been discredited by 3 independent reviews. Did you knowingly use flawed data, or were you unaware at the time?" The question cut cleaner than any raised voice. Alito didn't answer. He interrupted. "I suppose when your legal education is more about slogans than standards, you confuse questions with indictments." That was the moment the chamber shifted. The bait had been taken. Jasmine hadn't flinched, but Justice Alito had just drawn blood. And in a room full of cameras, that kind of wound never stays quiet. Alito leaned forward ever so slightly, elbows on the polished wood eyes, gleaming with the cruelty of a man who believed himself untouchable. The room held its breath. Then with a dry chuckle and the precision of a dagger, he spoke. "You fake your law degree better than you fake outrage." It didn't sound like a joke. It sounded rehearsed, like something he'd waited years to say to someone who dared to confront him from below the marble steps. Gasps scattered like broken glass across the chamber. Reporters froze mid-typing. Even the stenographer's hands paused just for a fraction of a second. Aide after aide turned toward Jasmine, half expecting her to rise, to shout, to storm out, to throw down every title she earned, but she didn't move. Not a blink, not a twitch. The camera locked on her face. No fury, no panic, just stillness like stone forged under pressure. Her eyes met his across the table, not with fear, but with something far more dangerous: restraint. She didn't swallow the insult. She caged it, let it echo inside her for just long enough to understand how deep the cut was meant to go. Alito, still smirking, leaned back like a man who thought he'd won the moment. But he didn't notice her fingers tighten slightly around the black envelope. He didn't notice the quiet shift in the room's energy, the way power had just started to move inch by inch away from him. Because sometimes the scariest person in the room isn't the one who yells. It's the one who doesn't flinch. What kind of woman doesn't blink when power tries to break her on live TV? Somewhere behind the cameras, Jasmine's phone vibrated just once. No sound, no alert. But she felt it like a warning shot across her palm. She glanced down briefly beneath the desk eyes, scanning the message from Andre Walker. I found it. The tape from '94. Her heart didn't race, but something colder shifted behind her ribs. She lifted her head slowly, locking eyes with Katie Porter, 2 seats down. No words. Just a look that said, "We move now." Andre had been a second-year Yale law student when it happened. Back then, Alito was still rising guest lecturing on judicial restraint, walking into that Ivy League lecture hall like a god in waiting. Andre remembered how it felt to be dismissed mid-question, how Alito had looked straight through him and called affirmative action a diversity circus. No one had believed him then, but he had kept the tape. Jasmine slid the black envelope closer to her body like drawing a blade. Alito was still speaking something about dignity and jurisprudence and restoring decorum. He had no idea the ghost of his own voice was already inside the building, threaded through the audio wires, just waiting to be unleashed. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She didn't need to, because what Andre had sent wasn't just a recording, it was the moment the mask would fall, and the nation was about to hear who Samuel Alito had always been before the robe, before the title, before he ever believed the cameras would catch him. The speakers clicked, and for a split second the entire chamber went dead still, like the building itself was holding its breath. Then the hiss of old tape rolled out, crackling like dry leaves before a fire. A young voice, recognizably Alito's, just decades lighter, cut through the silence. Some students are here to learn. Others were let in to fill boxes. The words didn't echo. They detonated. A second passed. Then 2. Then the sound of someone gasping off camera live. Reporters stopped typing mid-sentence. Phones slipped half an inch in sweaty palms. Aides whispered frantically behind folders. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't have to. The voice on the tape kept speaking, confident, unfiltered, untouched by the weight of robes or consequence. Diversity, it said, is a nice brochure term, but real legal minds don't come from pity policies. Alito sat frozen, face unreadable, but not because he didn't recognize it. He did. It was the version of himself he never thought would resurface, the version built on applause from closed rooms and unchecked authority. Catherine Liu from CNN whispered into her mic, "America is watching history bury itself alive." Jasmine's hands remained still on the desk. She didn't reach for her mic. She didn't glance at Alito. She just watched the room shift, watching justice arrive, not in shouting, but in tape and time. Because sometimes the loudest truth is the one that was recorded when no one thought the world would ever listen. And now the world couldn't stop listening. The audio faded, but his shadow clung to the room like smoke that refused to lift. Alito sat motionless, his fingers curled tightly on the desk jaw, locked behind the smirk that was now long gone. That single sentence, "fill boxes," had peeled back the years of polished opinions and Latin citations, leaving something raw and undeniable exposed. Before the silence could settle too long, Katie Porter slid a single chart onto the overhead screen. Bright red, stark, brutal. "Justice Alito," she said calmly. "Your rulings over the past 17 years show a 92.3% alignment with institutional power over individual plaintiffs, particularly in cases involving race, gender, or economic status." She paused, letting the number bleed into the oxygen. That includes denying appeals in 26 civil rights cases where lower courts were already split. The data wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. It was the kind of quiet math that leaves bruises. Jasmine finally moved her voice low but sharp. "Justice isn't blind if it keeps tripping over the same people." She didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. Her words landed like glass across marble, clean cutting, impossible to ignore. And this time when she looked at Alito, she didn't look through him. She looked directly into him. Can a nation trust a man who never truly believed in its people? Before the murmurs could settle from Katie's chart, Jasmine reached for the black envelope that had sat untouched since the hearing began. She didn't speak. She didn't rush. With deliberate precision, she broke the seal and slid out a single folded memo, thick ivory paper marked confidential. The edges worn like it had been carried too many times by someone deciding whether truth was worth the risk. The camera zoomed in. Everyone leaned forward not for the document itself, but for the weight they could feel it carried. She unfolded it once, twice, then laid it on the desk like an autopsy report. Portions of the text were redacted in heavy black ink, but one line dead center untouched sliced through the black bars like a scalpel. Ms. Rhea's speech patterns are too urban for courtroom decorum. A beat passed, then another. The room didn't gasp this time. It recoiled, slowly, deeply, like realizing the air itself had gone stale. Jasmine didn't offer context. She didn't need to. The memo had been written by a former clerk and insider, detailing how Alito privately dismissed Black and Latino clerks, mocked their accents, questioned their grooming, and routinely referred to them as unfit for constitutional literacy. No quotes, no interpretation, just ink and silence. Jasmine's fingers rested on the page like it was a verdict. Alito didn't blink, but his face, once carved in contempt, had gone still, like a man hearing his own echo turn against him for the first time. Because this wasn't hearsay, it was handwriting. His. The memo still lay open like a wound when the chair recognized a surprise witness request submitted quietly that morning by Jasmine's team. A young woman stepped forward from the back of the chamber, her posture tense but unshakable. She wore a simple navy blazer, no makeup, natural hair pulled into a tight bun. No nameplate, no law firm. Just a former intern who had once walked those marble halls believing she belonged until she was told she didn't. Her voice trembled at first. "My name is Lena Hart, Summer Clerkship Program 2020, Justice Alito's Chambers." She took a breath. "I was dismissed after 2 weeks. Another breath deeper this time. The reason given, presentation didn't meet judicial expectations." Her fingers gripped the edge of the podium. "But what I was told, in private, was that my braids and tone of voice were, quote, not aligned with courtroom professionalism." She glanced toward Alito, but not for approval, for accountability. Alito stared forward motionless. The room had fallen so silent it felt like sound itself had stepped outside. Lena continued. "I was told I could reapply if I tried a more neutral look. I didn't come back, and neither did my trust in that system." Her voice cracked just once, but her eyes never wavered. "I was 20, and for the first time I believed I had to choose between being who I was and becoming a lawyer." She stepped back without fanfare, tears pooled, but unfallen. Jasmine nodded once, not as a thank you, but as a promise. Lena Hart's story was no longer hidden. Now the entire country had heard it. Jasmine didn't speak right away. She sat unmoving as Lena Hart returned to her seat, the weight of truth still reverberating in the air like a tuning fork struck too hard. Alito's expression hadn't changed, but his silence had. It was no longer composed, it was cornered. His hands, once folded with courtroom precision, now tightened ever so slightly, fingertips pressed white against the oak. The robe he wore, the symbol he once weaponized as untouchable, suddenly looked less like dignity and more like camouflage. Only then did Jasmine lean forward, her fingers curling lightly around the base of the microphone. Her voice was low, not whispering, not trembling, but so steady it cut through the silence like a scalpel through velvet. "The robe doesn't cleanse your bias," she said. "It just hides it longer." She let the words sit. She let them burn. And when no one moved, she added calmly, clearly, "Until someone dares to pull it back." A ripple moved through the gallery, not applause, not outrage, just breath. The kind of collective exhale that follows truth spoken plainly, dangerously, in a place that was built to silence it. Jasmine didn't look at the press bench or the audience or the cameras. She looked straight at Alito, and for the first time all morning, he looked away. If we've normalized prejudice in robes, how do we unlearn silence? By the time the hearing broke for recess, the story had already outrun the building. C-SPAN looped the footage on a 15-minute cycle. CNN cut their midday panel short. MSNBC ran a side-by-side split Jasmine Crockett's still composed face and Justice Samuel Alito, mouth half open, caught in the moment his arrogance met something colder than fire. But the clip the nation couldn't stop watching wasn't the insult. It was the moment after. The freeze. The silence. The exact second Alito realized he'd said too much, and Jasmine said nothing at all. That 6-second pause became its own headline. Commentators called it the silence that spoke louder than any cross-examination. TikTok lawyers dissected her posture, her restraint, her ability to wield power without raising her voice. Online, a screenshot went viral. Jasmine's eyes fixed on Alito like a scalpel pressed against glass, unshaken, deliberate. Beneath it, the caption, "She didn't flinch, he did." And he had. That subtle shoulder twitch, the throat swallow, the brief glance away. Cable hosts argued about constitutional ethics. Twitter didn't care. They knew what they saw. For the first time in decades, a sitting Supreme Court justice looked like he was being judged, and not by the law, but by the people watching from their living rooms, classrooms, barbershops, and lunch counters across America. Power had shifted, not with a gavel, not with a ruling, but with a stare, and a silence that wouldn't let go. The silence hadn't lifted when Jasmine stood. She didn't ask for the floor. She didn't wait for permission. She rose like a verdict already written, measured, unshaking, forged in courtrooms without marble, without microphones, without mercy. Her heels echoed once across the chamber floor, and suddenly every camera panned. Even Alito turned as if pulled by something colder than fear. Her voice didn't rise. It cut. "You questioned my degree," she said, her tone as level as a scalpel. "I earned mine defending the people your decisions abandoned. While you wore robes and whispered judgment into history's ear, I was in courtrooms where justice came in handcuffs, where mothers prayed behind glass and fathers waited for verdicts that never came. No one moved, no one breathed. The temperature in the room didn't drop, it snapped. Her words weren't loud, but they thundered like truth that had waited too long to be spoken." She took one step forward, just enough to close the space between herself and the man who'd tried to belittle her with 7 words on national television. "I didn't fake anything, Justice Alito," she said. "But maybe you did fairness, integrity, and everything that robe was supposed to mean." He didn't respond. Couldn't. His silence, once weaponized, now hung around his neck like stone. And in that moment, for the first time, the robe didn't look powerful. It looked like something to hide behind. Outside the chamber, the tremors had already begun. One associate justice declined to comment, just 2 words, no statement. But silence now wasn't neutral. It was indictment. Hours later, Chief Justice Roberts released a carefully worded memo to the press. "The court takes allegations of bias seriously. Ethics must remain above reproach. No names, no blame. Just smoke curling from a building no longer sealed." Inside, Jasmine sat back down, slow and steady. Her eyes never left the bench. She didn't glance at the cameras. She didn't reach for water. She simply lowered herself into the chair like someone who had nothing left to prove and everything left to protect. She didn't smile. She didn't have to. Alito's face had turned into a mask, expressionless, pale, rigid, with a kind of disbelief, not at her words, but at their effect. He had worn the robe for decades like armor, but now under the lights, under her stare, it looked paper-thin. Something had shifted, not just in the room, but in the institution itself. The chamber wasn't echoing with outrage. It was echoing with something quieter, more dangerous realization. Because power doesn't break with fire, it breaks with fractures. If the foundation cracks in silence, will the nation still pretend it didn't hear it? Alito said nothing. Not a word. Not a protest. Not even a legal deflection wrapped in doctrine. The man who had once commanded courtrooms with paragraphs now sat in silence, dwarfed not by evidence, but by exposure. The chair beneath him seemed heavier than before. The robe around his shoulders, no longer regal, just cloth. The media pounced within minutes. The fall of the gavel splashed across chyrons like a final verdict. MSNBC called it a turning point in judicial accountability. CNN played Jasmine's voice on loop. "I earned mine defending the people your decisions abandoned," until even those who'd never heard her name before now whispered it over dinner tables and break rooms. TikTok flooded with edits, superimposing her words over thunder, over gavels, breaking over American flags, rippling in slow motion. But the power of that moment wasn't in volume. It was in the void. Alito had no answer, no defense. He had built a fortress on precedent, and Jasmine had knocked out its foundation with one scalpel-sharp sentence and a stare that never blinked. He didn't walk out. He didn't rise. He just sat there cornered by his own silence, swallowed by a country that had finally stopped looking away. And the bench, for the first time in decades, didn't look supreme. It looked exposed, fractured, human. Katie Porter stood with the ease of a professor and the precision of a prosecutor. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. With one flick of her remote, the monitor behind her lit up in red and black, a vertical bar graph, simple but devastating. Names of sitting justices lined the axis. At the top, towering over the rest, like a monument to quiet misconduct, Samuel Alito. Ethics complaints, public trust ratings, recusal violations. All stacked, all documented, all damning. She turned to the chamber, not to plead, but to confirm. "This chart doesn't accuse," she said. "It reflects." Her pointer hovered over Alito's name. When the public loses faith in the court, it doesn't begin with law, it begins with character. Her tone didn't flinch. Justice Alito's record isn't a one-time lapse. It's a pattern dressed in protocol. Alito remained still, but his hands were no longer folded. They were clenched. Jasmine watched without speaking, her expression carved from the same stillness that shattered him an hour earlier. Katie turned back to the room. "Power doesn't fear a lie," she said, voice quiet, deliberate, final. "It fears a woman who won't accept one." She placed the remote down gently, like setting the last stone on a grave. And in that moment, the air in the chamber shifted again, not with noise, but with clarity. Because this wasn't just an ending. It was a reckoning in motion. The heavy doors of the oversight chamber swung open, not with ceremony, but with consequence. Jasmine stepped into the marble hallway alone. No entourage, no notes in hand. Cameras caught every frame, the slow stride, the shoulders back, the head held not in arrogance, but in aftermath. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She walked like a verdict that didn't need to be read aloud. Outside, the crowd had grown from a few curious onlookers to hundreds. Law students from Howard, Yale, Berkeley, and even Liberty stood shoulder to shoulder, some with signs, some with silence, but all with one name on their lips. Jasmine, Jasmine, Jasmine. It wasn't a chant. It was thunder rolling up the steps of power, reverberating down through centuries of robes and rituals. Footage of her walk out played on a loop across every major network. MSNBC called it the most iconic 15 seconds in congressional history. Social media dubbed it the walk that shook the court. But Jasmine never turned back. She didn't need to. Her silence outside the chamber was louder than any sound inside it, because she hadn't come to speak for applause. She came to speak for accountability, and now every street, every screen, every classroom was echoing with the sound of a system finally being questioned. Was this a hearing or a turning point in American history? By nightfall, the tremor had reached the foundation. The House Judiciary Committee announced a formal ethics investigation into Justice Samuel Alito, citing patterns of conduct inconsistent with the integrity expected of the Supreme Court. The statement was brief, sterile, but behind closed doors, panic echoed. A government long afraid to touch the black robes was now circling with subpoenas in hand. By morning, a digital petition demanding Alito's resignation had crossed 2.3 million signatures. It surged not from fringe corners, but from law schools, civil rights organizations, military veterans, even retired judges. The number climbed by the minute, not because of partisanship, but because of something more: primal betrayal. Americans weren't just angry at what he said. They were stunned by what the silence had revealed. Cable news ran wall-to-wall coverage. Former clerks came forward. Leaked memos trickled out like blood through linen. Anonymous sources inside the court described internal discomfort, cracks in confidence, and tense distancing among the justices. Alito had always moved like a man untouchable. Now he moved like a man being watched from every angle. The system wasn't collapsing, not yet, but for the first time it was shaking, and the robe at the center of it all was no longer draped in reverence. It was trembling. The offers came fast: primetime interviews, magazine covers, keynote speeches. Every major network wanted Jasmine Crockett in their chair, holding their mic delivering the quote they could wrap in gold and replay for weeks. But she vanished instead. No press tour, no media blitz, just absence intentional, measured, deafening. Behind closed doors at a private caucus meeting, someone finally asked the question everyone was waiting to broadcast. Do you realize you just dismantled a Supreme Court justice on live television? Jasmine looked up only once, eyes calm, voice like stone cutting glass. I didn't win, she said. I revealed. The room went still, not in confusion but in recognition. There were no victory laps, no sound bites, no self-congratulation, because she hadn't fought for applause. She had fought to rip the curtain back and then walked away, leaving the country to decide what it had just seen. That was what made it burn deeper. She could have owned the headlines. Instead, she disappeared into silence because that's where truth echoes loudest. From coast to coast, the ripple became a wave. In classrooms from UCLA to Howard constitutional law professors abandoned their lesson plans. Instead, they played the footage, Jasmine at the mic, Alito, frozen in his chair, silence thundering louder than any gavel. Students leaned forward not out of obligation, but out of urgency. This wasn't history. This was a mirror. In one seminar, a third-year student stood up and said what no textbook ever taught. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. The room didn't applaud, they wrote it down. At NYU, a professor called it the first ethical inflection point in Supreme Court culture since Watergate. At Spelman, they held a vigil not for Alito, but for every aspiring lawyer ever told their hair, voice, or background wasn't courtroom enough. Clips of Jasmine's confrontation were now used not for drama, but for doctrine. Professors rewrote assignments. Debate teams quoted her on ethics. Mock trials ended with new rules, ones born from her restraint, not rage. Law was no longer just about arguments. It was about what you refused to let pass in silence. Because power didn't flinch when challenged by noise. It flinched when someone demanded truth and stayed standing when the system tried to ignore her. Will the next generation demand louder justice or deeper truth? Night settled over the Capitol like a curtain drawn after the final act. The cameras were gone, the headlines written the echoes of a historic hearing, now fading into archive silence. But in a corner office lit only by a desk lamp, Jasmine Crockett remained. No aides, no statements. Just her, a glass of water untouched, and a folder pulled from the bottom drawer worn creased private. Inside was a letter. Not addressed to a judge, a president, or a committee, but to herself. Written 15 years earlier on the edge of a dorm room desk, when the idea of standing before power felt impossibly distant. Her fingers traced the ink like rediscovering a scar. She unfolded the page and read aloud softly. One day they'll try to humiliate you. You'll stay calm, but you'll never stay small. She exhaled slow, not relief, resolution. That young woman who wrote it had no camera, no title, no microphone, just a voice, and the promise never to let anyone shrink it. Jasmine smiled, not wide, not proud, just enough to say, you made it here, and you didn't flinch, because the robe didn't win, and silence didn't lose. It remembered. The closing montage rolled as the credits faded, but this wasn't the usual broadcast send-off. There were no pundits arguing in split screens, just raw footage stitched together from across the nation. In Southside Chicago, a mural bloomed across a brick wall. Jasmine Crockett eyes, steady lips, pressed head unbowed. In Atlanta, a bookstore replaced its front display with her testimony, a transcript line by line. In Oakland, a group of teenage girls stood outside a courthouse, holding handwritten signs that simply read, "She didn't yell, she didn't kneel, she stood." This wasn't idol worship, it was recognition. In barbershops, libraries, classrooms, kitchen tables, her face wasn't being framed as a hero. It was being remembered as a path. Because Jasmine hadn't just spoken truth to power, she exposed the machinery behind the silence. She showed what justice could sound like when it didn't shout but refused to bow. For communities long ignored, long judged, long underestimated, she wasn't a symbol. She was proof that you could walk into a room built to break you and leave it trembling behind you. Not because you demanded a crown, but because you carried a mirror. The screen faded to black, but the voice remained low, steady, echoing, like it came from somewhere deeper than the room. Jasmine's image lingered in silhouette, not behind a podium, not in front of cameras, but standing alone facing forward, as if daring history to blink first. The voiceover didn't shout. It didn't plead. It landed like a truth too long buried. Justice doesn't come when power speaks, the voice said. It comes when someone finally refuses to stay silent. A pause. Heavy, intentional. Like the silence before a verdict. Then came the question, not scripted, not softened, just real. Have you ever been told you don't belong just because you're different? The words didn't fade, they hung, in the space between shame and defiance. It's time we remember justice doesn't come from the highest seat in the room. It comes from the one who dares to face it without bowing. Silence is no longer an option when the truth is twisted in plain sight. At any age, dignity and conviction can still open the doors that power tries to keep shut. Have you ever stayed silent because they said you didn't belong? Share your story. Someone out there may be waiting to feel less alone. If this story shook something in, you don't just scroll past it. Like, share and subscribe to Hill Insights, where silence isn't weakness and truth doesn't ask for permission. Hit the bell because the next moment that matters might begin with your voice. What part made you pause? Made you feel seen? Tell us in the comments. This isn't just a story, it's a conversation, and your voice belongs in it. This dramatized story is inspired by real struggles and real people. All characters and dialogue are fictionalized for commentary and education. It is not intended to defame or mislead, but to inspire reflection and civic awareness. Thanks for watching. Truth isn't over, it's just waiting to be heard.